Today's guest is Dr. Aubrey de Grey. He is an English author and biomedical gerontologist. He is the Chief Science Officer of the SENS Research Foundation and VP of New Technology Discovery at AgeX Therapeutics. He is an Editor-in-Chief of the academic journal Rejuvenation Research, author of the Mitochondrial Free Radical Theory of Aging, and co-author of Ending Aging. He is known for his view that medical technology may enable human beings alive today not to die from age-related causes. He has also contributed to the study of the Hadwiger-Nielsen problem. From X, I'm Felix Tuchinski, and this is Humanity and Beyond. Right in the thick of it, one of the things that was very interesting to me is I listened to you on several podcasts and TED Talks you've given. You spoke about how when you were 8 or 9 years old, you recognized that you wanted to change the world. And you've also spoken about how important education is. And I was wondering if you might think about combining those two philosophies, and if you think that your worldview as a child should be instilled in children, if that's, if it can be instilled at some point in the educational system, or if it's better to teach parents to teach this to their children in their own time.
Yes, I think there is some value in that. But let me elaborate a little bit. I'll explain why I'm a little hesitant. So the thing is, to a very large extent, kids are already in that mindset because they have not yet been ground down by failure. Right. So, they're already willing to aim high and to think high. And, one of the more interesting recent developments in my work is that over the past few years, there's been an increasing number of people coming in and supporting this work, whether financially or otherwise, who are kind of what I've been calling children of the revolution. They are people who came across my book, for example, when they were teenagers. A classic example would be Vitalik Buterin, the guy who created Ethereum. He read my book when he was 14, and he's now one of our biggest donors. Now, the thing about this is people like that are coming out of the woodwork in increasing numbers precisely because they never had to change their minds about aging. They had never kind of, made their peace with aging and decided that, oh yeah, this is just something I've got to live with. And so my message kind of resonated with those people at an early age very easily. I think, yes, if we therefore can help kids to retain that willingness to aim high, then yes, we will definitely be having a benefit. And one huge part of that is to give kids the ability to stay the course, to be resilient to failure, because failures do happen, right? I remember another thing that happened in my childhood, which I don't think I've mentioned in interviews. I could have done, I'm not sure. So when I was, 18 maybe, I just left school, and I had some time off before university. I took an unusually long time off before university, nearly 2 years. During that time, I applied for a job. And it was a job that I was no way qualified for at one of the major microcomputer manufacturers in the UK. And I told a guy that I knew, who was a good deal older than me, that I was doing this. And he said, I shouldn't be doing this. He said, you shouldn't apply because you're not going to get the job, and it's going to depress you. You're just going to not enjoy this. But I went ahead and applied for the job anyway. And sure enough, I didn't get it. And I observed that it didn't depress me at all. I totally took it in my stride. And I decided, well, that means something. This means that it's fine for me to adopt a kind of high risk, high reward strategy in life, to aim high. And yeah, I'm going to fail a lot. But when I don't, I'm going to make much more difference than if I were just doing easy stuff. So I've lived my life that way. And I think if we can give kids the ability to do that, to actually, not get depressed by failure, then they will aim high more. The reason I think this is so important is because of where I am now, geographically, in Silicon Valley.
Right.
So people often think, what is so special about the Bay Area that has allowed it to be the epicenter of technological progress across the planet? And it's exactly that. It's the attitude to failure. everywhere else in the world, even elsewhere in the US, if you try something and you fail, then most people will conclude that you're not very good. But in Silicon Valley, it's not like that. In Silicon Valley, if you try something and you fail, then most people will conclude that you had the courage to try something that was so hard that you couldn't do it. And therefore, they will say that you're the right kind of person who should be given the chance to try again. That is why Silicon Valley is what it is.
Yeah, and that would require such a change in structure. I mean, the entire educational system, at least in the United States, is based around grades, where if you don't even get 70% accuracy, which could be affected by a multitude of factors, then you failed.
Yes, but as I say, it's not about whether you fail. It's about what happens next. It's about whether you are considered a failure if you fail, or whether you're considered to be given, whether that is an opportunity to try again.
I see the connection between that and the foundation in your organization. Sorry, let me look. I always forget. The Strategies for Engineered Negligible Senescence, the SENS Research Foundation, correct?
SENS Foundation, that's right. Yeah, we don't tend to spell out what it stands for. It's too long.
Too long? Yeah. All right. So my question was, what kind of research are you focused on right now? And has that affected your estimate, actually? Because I remember you speaking recently that you said in 3 to 5 years we'd reach a point where a politician would not be able to be elected, unless they had that sort of a platform on their policies. So what is your organization doing to get us to that day, I should say?
Okay, so there's a bunch of questions in that question. So
I apologize. Yeah.
Yeah, no problem. Well, first of all, what are we doing? So what I guess you probably do understand is that SENS is a divide and conquer strategy. We have a bunch of different types of damage that the body accumulates throughout life, any one of which can kill you on its own, more or less on schedule, however well we fix all the others. So we have to fix all of them reasonably well in order to get the result. And that means that our focus at SENS has always been to fill in the gaps, to prioritize the more neglected areas, which usually means the most difficult ones that other people are basically avoiding because they have constraints that we don't have in terms of requiring to work on low-hanging fruit so that they can get a product really quickly and make money in industry. Or in academia, it's more a case of getting publications really quickly and getting a track record so that they can get the next grant application funded. Yeah, we don't have that. We publish, but we publish when we're ready, not when we have. We don't choose what to do for the purpose of publishing. So we work on a bunch of different things. At the moment, we've got a couple of projects in-house and 4 projects that we fund in universities, very diverse across the whole range of damage repair. And that's how it's always going to be. Luckily, we don't have to work on everything because quite a few of the things that we used to work on have now got far enough along that we could spin them out as startup companies. That becomes possible, of course, when people who don't like giving money away, but who do have a belief in the mission, and if they have some kind of upside that they can hope that they'll eventually be able to make money, then that's good enough. So people, investors will write much bigger checks than donors do. So this is something we try to do as quickly as we can for any given project to spin it out, because then the project will, of course, go a lot faster. Now, to come to the time frame aspect of what you asked a moment ago, let me break that down a little bit because it goes in steps. So as I'm sure you know, I maybe 16, 17 years ago started to talk about the concept of longevity escape velocity, which is the minimum rate at which we need to improve therapies in order to keep people youthful and have their biological age simply not get greater as time goes on. Their chronological age gets greater. Now, we need to reach longevity escape velocity first, and then we need to maintain it. And because of the nature of what would need to be done, it's as good as guaranteed that once we get there, once we start to bring people's age down rather than up in biological terms, we will continue to be able to do that thereafter for as long as we like. But I think we're still quite some way off from getting there. 15 years ago, I said that I thought we had a 50% chance of getting to longevity escape velocity within 25 years. So that would mean it's only 10 years away now. And actually, I think it's more like 16 or 17 years away now. So we have slipped. But we're not slipping very fast, not anymore anyway. we were slipping very fast early on, and that was entirely because of lack of funding. Research was going maybe 1/2 or 1/3 as quickly as it could have gone if money had not been limiting.
Have you found that any areas, because I remember your organization identified 7 specific things. I won't detail them here, but were any particularly hard to get funding for? Were any investors just particularly like, okay, I see where you're going here, but these things I just don't understand?
It's not a matter of understanding. It's a matter of where the stage of the thing was. So yes, there's definitely a spectrum there. Some things have been already investable even before we came along, stem cell therapy in particular. Other things were more, we had to get them to the point where they became investable. They were not investable at first, and there are some things which are still not investable because they're not far enough along. But everything is progressing. So that our goal is to put ourselves as a non-profit out of business because we can declare victory, and say, the private sector is coping fine with all of this. But yeah, so it's just a matter of pushing everything along as fast as possible. So in terms of timeframes, back to what you were asking, I still think it's some way off. But the critical time when the shit's really going to hit the fan, when we're going to have the real period of turbulence, the critical juncture is not when the therapies arrive. It is when the therapies become widely anticipated. In other words, when progress, not in the clinic, but in the laboratory, in mice and such like, is sufficiently strong, sufficiently impressive, that the leading scientists in the field are willing to say publicly that, yeah, this is coming. It's just a matter of time. In other words, to basically say what I've been saying for 15 years.
Right.
So you may first of all ask, why have my other expert colleagues, not been saying it already, same as I have? And it's partly because they're not quite so optimistic as me, but mostly it's not that. Mostly it's because they have a big constraint that I don't have, namely, which I already alluded to in terms of funding. Michael, everybody else, there's only about a dozen people in the world who would be classified as, opinion formers in the aging world. People who are experts on the biology of aging, who do a lot of public outreach and speaking and interviews and so on. I'm just one of those people. But we're all good friends, obviously, right? So the question is, what's different? The answer is they all have faculty positions at, prestigious universities, and they need to keep those positions in order to carry on getting funding from grants from the government and so on, in order to do their research. There's never enough funding from those sources, so people are always looking for reasons to say no to a grant application. And a perfectly good, safe reason to say no is if you can say, oh, this guy said something irresponsible to the media last week, right? So my colleagues have to be incredibly curmudgeonly and pessimist and err on the side of pessimism in what they say, to avoid, raising expectations and over-promising and under-delivering, right? I don't have that problem, so I can tell it like it is. But, of course, as time goes on and progress is actually made in the laboratory, what other people can get away with saying publicly also improves. And I believe we're only a couple of years away from the point where the things that people say publicly, not just that I say, will be sufficiently optimistic and confident that essentially people will stop being scared of getting their hopes up. That's what it is at the moment. People know that it might or might not be in time for them, so they're kind of got an intuition of what the probability is that it will be in time for them, and it's not high enough for them to want to believe in it and get emotionally invested in it. So they have to keep some kind of emotional distance from it and treat the whole thing as entertainment more than reality and expectation.
We'll be right back. We just want to thank all our listeners, and especially our supporters. Without you, this would not be possible. If you want to support us, you can do so just by spreading this podcast on social media. Coming up is our community question. If you want the chance to have your question featured, just tweet @HumanityXBeyond. So I was wondering, how involved are you with Retrotransposition research?
We do some of it.
Yeah.
One of the groups we fund is working on that. It's really become quite prominent right now. I suspect that the reason you're asking the question is because David Sinclair has talked about it a lot in his recent book. He's definitely one of that dozen people I mentioned earlier.
Right.
And actually, I will say that David is kind of stands out as probably the most courageous of my colleagues in terms of what he's willing to say. So last year, the book he wrote, of course, had a title. It said, "Why We Age and Why We Don't Have to."
Wow.
If he'd written a book with that title even 5 years ago, he would have had a very uncomfortable conversation with his dean. David is very keen on this idea. And it could be important. I mean, the jury is still out. Experiments are still being done very much, including by David himself. But it's reasonable to suppose that this retrotransposition process is substantially responsible for the damage to DNA that happens throughout life in our cells, which means, of course, that it could be a substantial cause of cancer. And of course, cancer is definitely something we need to fix.
Of course.
And so we're working on that. In our work at SENS, and in my philosophy of how to do this, we focus on the cancer itself rather than on the individual causes of mutation. So we're interested in getting rid of cells if they have incurred particularly damaging carcinogenic mutations, rather than stopping the mutations from happening in the first place. But it's still different ways of going about addressing the same problem. So we are basically in agreement.
So another thing I wanted to note was I've asked this question to people before, but is there a way to simplify the difference between CRISPR and Cas9?
Yeah, sure. There's no difference between them.
Oh, okay.
They are two parts of the same machinery. So Cas9 is an enzyme which cuts DNA. CRISPR is the repeats of DNA that exist in the bacterial genome that essentially used as pigeonholes to put bits of other DNA from viruses that infect bacteria. So what we're interested in is actually those bits that are put into the pigeonholes.
Okay.
Or to be more precise, the RNA that is transcribed from those bits. These are things called guide RNAs, and they have obviously a particular sequence, a particular nucleotide sequence. The guide RNA is what tells Cas9 where to cut the DNA. The guide RNA is, binds, hybridizes, as it's called, to the particular corresponding sequence of DNA in the cell, and Cas9 goes and cuts that DNA.
I could see why it's taking 17 years to get this process in a safe level in humans.
Well, CRISPR is only about 7 or 8 years old, actually, in terms of how long people have been studying it, and it's been moving unbelievably fast. The main thing that's been slowing it down is actually that the original version of CRISPR that was first pursued turned out not to be a very good choice, because it has a reasonably high level of what's called off-target effect. In other words, the Cas9 enzyme cuts the wrong DNA sometimes. Not only occasionally, but a bit too often for safety. In fact, George Church, one of the pioneers in this area, he calls it genomic vandalism. But there are much better versions of CRISPR that have been identified and are being pursued now. And so, we're well on the way to having CRISPR machinery that does exactly what we would like it to do and doesn't do anything else. And there are variations on using the same idea. For example, you can have the guide RNA be used to target a modified version of Cas9 that doesn't cut the DNA at all, but instead does whatever else you want it to do, because you fuse the enzyme with another enzyme that does something else. So there's loads of little clever machinery that you can do in the same way.
So how's the research on Parkinson's disease going? Because in 2015, your best estimate was it would be cured in 10 years. We're halfway through those 10 years.
I would say we're on schedule there. So the first clinical trial of stem cell therapy using induced pluripotent stem cells for Parkinson's disease is in progress. It's based in Japan. And there's, I think, at least 3 more clinical trials that are imminent that are doing the same thing in slightly different ways. Of course, that's what you need. You need a variety of, variations on the theme in order to get it working properly, to find something that really works. Those clinical trials will definitely be, have completed and moved on to, larger stage, phase 3 and so on. So I think, we're looking like within 5 years that's quite likely to be ready for prime time.
Amazing. All right. So I was to say that people in my organization were very excited to have me ask this question would be an understatement. So Humanity and Beyond is more focused towards potential Mars colonization. We recently had a submission to it's like $1 million reward for designing a city to house 1 million people on Mars. And so obviously that's where, living on Mars, that brings up a bunch of questions about like, well, should we make the humans there more resilient to the radiation? And then that brings up the ethical question. So I want to know what your opinion was in regards to altering humans when it came to Mars colonization. Like, would it be right to make Homo eres, for example?
Well, yeah, let me give a rather boring answer. So I'm not terribly keen on Mars, to be honest. I like it down here. And I think I'm probably in the majority there. I mean, Mars is fine. If people want to go there, they're welcome. And yes, there are challenges, not only in living on Mars, in terms of radiation and such like, but also in getting there. That's probably the hardest part.
Fair enough.
Right. But yeah, we will figure that out. No question. One thing that particularly annoys me, so let me, even though it's not your question, let me answer it anyway.
Go ahead.
Is that some people say that going and colonizing Mars and then other planets is the way to address the problem that people constantly come up with of, oh dear, where will we put all the people if we don't have aging? Which is complete bullshit. Partly because people don't want to go there, which is quite important, really, because if you tell people that the solution is something that they don't actually want to do, then they're not going to be very interested and impressed. But also because there's not enough space up there. Mars is smaller than the Earth, and we're only going to be able to at most double the number of people that we can have if that's all we do. And in general, you just can't get far enough away from the Earth in enough time to use this as a solution. Anyway, so back to your question. What do I think about enhancement? Well, so as I say, I don't regard going to Mars as much of a motivation, but enhancement itself per se is a different matter entirely. And so we have to kind of define what we mean. A lot of people, call me a transhumanist. They say, I think I was the first recipient of something called the H.G. Wells Award for outstanding contributions to transhumanism. And it was a bit embarrassing, really, because I do not regard myself as a transhumanist at all.
All right.
I just do medical research. I'm interested in therapy. I'm interested in keeping people healthy. And yeah, I mean, the reason why people do this is because they look at the side effect of longevity and they say, oh, we're going to make people live forever. That's enhancement. And therefore, Aubrey's a transhumanist. I say that's bollocks. I say, longevity is just a side effect of not being sick. And so, I'm just helping people not to be sick and to be the same as normal young adults are today. So that makes us a therapy, not an enhancement. But that doesn't mean I'm against enhancement. The same technologies that are used for therapy are often very straightforwardly, reusable for other means. And I would not be at all surprised if in the longer term, we, for example, are able to modify the body so that we have wings or gills or whatever. This is something that I don't think there's any particular ethical problem with. The area that is most talked about these days in terms of enhancement, though, is neural enhancement. So Elon Musk in particular, I'm a big fan of Elon Musk. He's working on this thing called Neuralink, and various other people are working on the same kind of thing to improve brain-computer interfaces. Again, this straddles the boundary between therapy and enhancement, because certainly when people have brain damage or they have some kind of locked-in syndrome, it would be great if they could have a greater interaction with the outside world through electronic means. And this is precisely the proximate, the nearest application for the kind of technology that Elon is trying to develop. But equally, it's perfectly clear that such technology could be used to increase the bandwidth between the outside world and a perfectly healthy human brain. And, maybe that's a good thing. As far as I'm concerned, it doesn't really matter whether the machinery that you're interfacing with is inside the body or outside. But it kind of does matter subjectively. People kind of think that if you put something inside the skull, then it's an enhancement, whereas otherwise it's just a machine that you're interfacing with, but bandwidth does matter. So I'm open-minded about all of this. I really, I don't think I have anything particularly unusual to say about these questions.
You did touch a little bit on the societal change, and maybe the overpopulation obviously isn't going to be as big of a problem as we think it is. There are some obvious effects on the economic side of things in terms of retirement age and all that. How do you think we'll cope with people having 2 or 3 careers?
The thing is, this is an example, probably the number one example, of a mistake that is extraordinarily ubiquitous. Namely, people will constantly imagine a post-aging world wrongly, in the sense that they will imagine it as if every other aspect of that world is more or less the same as today. So, for example, they will say, oh dear, well, how will we pay the pensions? Now, the first question to ask is, will there be pensions? Will there be work even? And of course, we know perfectly well that there functionally won't be because of automation, which is coming really fast. Even conservative commentators like the United Nations are saying publicly that most of the jobs that exist today will not exist 20 years from now. 20 years from now, that's the same time frame that I'm talking about for the fixing of aging, right?
That's kind of ridiculous, yeah.
Right. And of course, that's a relatively conservative estimate. I wouldn't be at all surprised if we get to a point in the next few decades where work is a bit like conscription, national service, as it used to be called in the UK, where, where the young adult, you are legally required to do a few years of it. And then you just don't have to do any anymore because there's not enough work to go around. It becomes a non-question in that circumstance. Obviously, yes, there's a whole bunch of restructuring that needs to be done to society to arrange for an equitable distribution of wealth and quality of life and everything, but that's happening anyway. It's not something that's caused by the elimination of aging.
Wow, I don't have anything else for you. If you'd like to advertise something that you're going on, or if you'd like to clarify anything that you've said before or emphasize something you're working on, the floor is yours.
Yeah, so we're a non-profit, we're a charity, so anyone who wants to support us financially can get a tax write-off, and that would be very welcome. There's a nice friendly donate button on the webpage. But at the website, there is a huge amount of information written for every kind of audience, from all the way from real experts down to complete novices, and there's a place to write questions if you can't find your answers, and we're very good at responding to anything. So yeah, please go to SENS.org and find out more.
Thank you for a glorious 30 minutes. I'm thankful I got to speak with somebody as highly educated as yourself. Have a good day, Professor.
Likewise, same to you.